Doc, you talked about how we can stimulate tissue to grow. We can maintain tissue or even retrain tissue at a certain point, but then we can also detrain tissue. And so I think it's all dependent on what signals we're sending at what times. But these all three zones are important to learn and understand when we are talking about the whole tissue and body as a training concept. What does that look like, and how do we target each zone?
So we'll have a visual for those that are just listening. So when you're going into working out, when you're trying to rehab train, you can gauge your nervous system a little bit easier. We've been talking about the stimulating zone, to where you go to a high amount of intensity or at a great deal of speed, or you go until consistent movement till failure, like those 4 different types of strength training. Regardless, we want to send the signal as hard as we possibly can. We only need one signal sent, either for probably within 24 hours, 12 to 24 hours, because you could go into probably 2 different sessions to send the signal. Depends on the recovery aspect of your nervous system, which will matter so much, which will have the greater deal of growth potential, because we know sleeping causes most gains, recovery, rest causes most gains at that time. So when we're getting into trying to increase that stimulus, you're going to start noticing, even with accommodation of the intensity, if you spend and do every train session for maybe multiple body areas, you're going to start noticing that the body's going to acclimate to that higher intensity. And that's where you start noticing that you can also plateau there. So that's where you have to work that stimulus in with retraining zones at the same time. So stimulating, high, strong signal, you want to adapt to grow. Now let's say, and this can be sport specific, this can be rehab specific. Let's say, for example, we have a tendinopathy or like strain of bicep tendon, shoulder supraspinatus. It's hard for us to lift the arm. A couple things going on with the rotator cuff. Doesn't really matter too much. When we're thinking from the perspective of stimulus intensity signal, we want to make sure that we're targeting a very specific structure that is injured, and that we're varying the intensity of the stimulus. As the injury starts to get better, you start noticing more range of motion, less pain. You can start increasing the stimulus higher and higher into the detraining zone. So like going back to the point, 25, 50% intensity, 50 to 100%, 95% intensity. So the more strength you're getting back, the more resources their body is sending, but also at the same time, once you rehab that area to where you feel like you're back to normal, you're probably not yet. If there's any injury, it leaves anatomical change to the body long term. So you have to consistently maintain that, but you can build that up. So once you're able to get to your highest intensity after that injury and ramp it up, give yourself a couple weeks to one monitor and maintain, not between sessions, but maybe one signal sent to that injured tissue after everything's been built up. At the end of the rehab portion, that's when you can start getting to the stimulus and then a retraining zone. So it's not all the way until you are able to ramp up that intensity at 100%, anywhere from 3 to 20 seconds, 3 to 30 seconds of holding that signal of intensity at a high rate and feeling decent for days afterwards. You're probably going to be sore due to delayed onset muscle soreness, DOMS, but then you can get into retraining zones and kind of work it in to the cycle of what body area you want to work on certain days, certain weeks, certain times of the month.
I think it's important another way to think of that would be like you were able to lift your max that you haven't been able to lift in a while one time. Okay, try twice, 3 times. Okay, 3 times I couldn't quite do it. And you're like, all right, so maybe you're not fully how you should have been, you know what I mean? Or even just a little bit under max. But now let's say you continue to weights, train, the next thing you know, you try it again in 2 weeks, and you did that just under max 12 times. Now you're thinking, okay, at the 3, I wasn't fully back to where I was. So now you just have to understand how much that should be thought about when we are trying to gauge if we're ready to call ourselves healed, I guess is maybe the best way to put it. But anytime we train, we're very at a superficial level breaking or destroying tissue. So are we really ever fully healed? No, it's just making sure that we give our body the appropriate recovery needed at each time, because they're little minor insults. And then there are times where those insults are possibly a little bit bigger or smaller. Whether we lift something wrong, that insult just became worse because it was put on the tissue that wasn't ready and ended up doing something that was more harmful. Now, eventually, that insult may even turn into an injury.
Yes.
That's where, we start to lose the ability to lift, and the range of motion goes down, and now you're in a much, much worse position. So when you get to that point where you're lifting and then you had a little tweak and you're like, okay, yeah, I think I'm good now. That was an insult and that was a message. And you just have to make sure that you catch those, because if you are doing something wrong, you're more than likely going to get a message, an insult. And eventually those insults will cycle into an injury, and you got to make sure not to have it get to that point.
Yes, and I love the direction you're taking that. That then goes back to, what are we training? What signal is sent to what specific
Beautiful.
tissue?
Beautiful.
So we're saying the highest stimulating zone, highest bout of intensity. Is that going to the muscle? Is that going to the connective tissue, ligaments, tendons? Is that going to the joint capsule? Are we trying to open up range of motion? That's where you have to be very specific on, are we going to the muscle? If so, it's going to be concentric, eccentric. We're doing the traditional lift. Yep. Maybe you're changing the angle. So like, for example, I suggest you guys to try this at a lighter weight starting off if you haven't tried this before. Bench press, for example, for those that are not watching. Traditional bench press, okay? Now, how often are you going either bench press, like working your way up from neutral to almost like up overhead, but as you're laying down, versus, so incline versus decline, but doing this all at a flat surface. So that's changing the different pulling mechanisms on certain tissues. Okay, so there's muscle also. I love you guys to try this. Let's change as we're rotating the arms, like we're tilting side to side. Be careful when you tilt at the top, because you can jam that chromium from the supinator and some of the other tissues, and can affect the bicep head tendon. So be cautious as you're tilting with higher weight.
Control movements.
Yes.
Make sure you feel in control the whole time.
Love that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that's where form matters. If you're going to stay in neutral zone, you can ramp up higher intensities, the areas that your bodies and tissues are accustomed to. But if you go into different zones that you're not accustomed to, higher amount of focus attention, diminish the weight that you're putting those load under, because if you're not training this area, higher risk of injury. And that's where, if you're not training certain positions in athletic events, you're going to start noticing different injuries, because the tissues aren't able to absorb the force or angle against gravity or against weight or against an opponent, and then they just give out and yield from there.
Yep.
So going back to the point, let's say bench press, right? How often are you squeezing the weight at top with all your muscles or all your arms straight? So at length, holding a weight, load under tension, and contracting all the muscles from there. That'll bleed subsequently a little bit more pressure on the joints, but it bleeds more energy to like the ligaments, tendons on the muscle belly, because we're loading at length versus with everything short. So let's say we're holding the weight in a bench press when everything's lowered to the chest. So that is where we can start noticing, are we training in a short range when everything's either for our arms, they're short, chest is open, versus at the top, chest is short, contracted, versus arms straight. So then you can start zoning in the bench press. Am I working specifically on the bicep tendon around the elbow, or am I working the chest, the pec major on the insertion, origin attachment, and building up that connective tissue? So you have to start looking at from each tissue, each joint level within a certain movement. Then you have to be specific, like where are we training? So build up from there.
Yes. And too many are not training the connective tissue and joints.
Oh, definitely not.
Huge miss. People are missing out there. Yeah.
Now, retraining zones. And this is where most people that work out on a regular basis, they're staying in this retraining zone to where maybe they're not sending the signal for the tissues to rebuild. They're doing a lot of work. They feel like they're putting the effort. It's maybe a moderate intensity instead of the highest intensity. And that's okay to be in this range because we're still maintaining tissues to where some of the research is at. Depends on what property that you want to train, but strength hypertrophy is anywhere of training plus or minus, God, if I remember off the top of my head, 16 to 24 days-ish. Don't quote me on that. I think I'll have an image I can pull up. Versus, let's say we want to go at speed. Speed, you have to train every plus or minus 5 to 7 days.
Yeah.
And then let's say we want to maintain certain areas of certain muscle tissue that maybe you don't use on an everyday basis, but other areas of the body that you want to maintain. That's where it's like a plus or minus like 20 to 30 days. So if you just want one stimulus at a high intensity signal, at a high retraining zone or stimulating zone, once every 30 days, once every 16 to 20 some days, you can start mapping that out on your calendar. Today, I'm doing this body area at this zone for this amount of time. You can be incredibly specific, not have a very low risk of injury compared to everyone else. You can have peace of mind that you have the best quality programming for you. And then if you do workspaces or joints, you can monitor and maintain each joint capsule, each tissue on a daily basis.
Yep.
So there you have a recipe for success. But
Yep.
yeah. So with this retraining zone, this maintenance recalibration, let's say you're setting the stimulus in a workout session, for this example, the bicep, but maybe we want to do a retraining. So instead of doing arms, maybe we're setting the signal for the biceps, but we're still doing moderate intensity weight. We're not just pushing ourselves on the triceps. This can be for any other part of the body because we want to maximize the resources in our body for the recovery aspect, but we also want the signal sent to the exact area. So that's where we have to be very, like we said, very specific. And then that kind of brings us into our next training zone, this detraining zone. And this is where, for us as physicians, for people that are starting the rehab process from any acute injuries, this is the process. This is the zone that we want to build in.
Sure.
And be around. And then from there, and I was thinking about this, funny enough, in the shower this morning, like how can we push people? Because we start noticing people get better. They're out of pain. Once they're out of pain, they stop coming into the office because I don't need any more. And then, like in my mind, I'm cringing because the pain is the first thing to go. But yes, we built them up. We helped them. We're a team along this health journey. But they haven't built up the tissues to the fullest resilience. They haven't pushed themselves too much, and it's working out of the detraining zone and trying to push that stimulus as much as we can. And that's where partially our challenge of the week came from. On certain positions, we have patients go in and they win a $10 Sal and Go gift card. And that was mainly so we can push the intensity for certain people at certain times.
And I love that.
Yeah.
Because I think you're right. I think individuals a lot of the time use pain as an indicator of health, which it's a part of it, but it's not the whole story. And too many times they wait until the pain is gone and then they just resume daily activities and the pain comes back again because they weren't fully healed and or conditioned after that injury. We talk about that all the time, how to appropriately heal an injury to its fullest completion, because if you don't, your chance of injury only continues after you keep injuring it.
Going back to the detraining zones, this is where you can use like either a deloading phase. So let's say you're going through your training, you're ramping up your intensity, you're at a high point, you're like maybe at week 6 out of 6 in your hypertrophy power training, and you're wanting to end that cycle. This is where you can also go back into the detraining, maybe take a week of very light movement, maybe go to see a massage therapist, chiropractor, do some rehab, light intensity type movements, just to get your body acclimated. So we're ramping up off that nervous system for a good solid week, can be up to 10 days as well. And then you can build up either a different mesocycle or different, let's say we want to train maybe speed plyos for a 6-week train. Maybe we want to train like strength, hypertrophy, doesn't matter. So you can build up from there, but use these detraining zones to offload what you've already done to build up into something else, but that varies based on the intensity of the nervous system.
Sure.
Day-to-day basis, if we will. So very important, detraining zone, heal, rebuild, reload. Very important to understand stimulating, retraining, detraining, and then what specific tissues are you sending, because that way it goes back to our point of specific adaptation to imposed demands, to where we're sending a very specific signal to a very specific tissue for that tissue to adapt to imposed demands.
Yes.
It's one of those things. And then as you're varying based on the accommodation principle, not doing a high intensity stimulus for an area for every single time, but to offload, detrain it to like moderate intensity, and then touch that peak of high intensity and come back down.
Do you feel like Galpin's analogy of the bowling alley would
Yeah.
fit that in a way?
I think so, yeah.
Being able to come off and adapt helps to keep the adaptation of the tissue stronger, because you're going from not just stimulus, because eventually stimulus alone, volume alone, your body, your bowling alley gets smaller.
Or do you want to explain what that was?
Yeah. So he talked about in terms of HRV, heart rate variability, where you can put yourself into a state of stress and then try to bring yourself back down into a parasympathetic state. And so you go from sympathetic to parasympathetic. Now, if you don't put yourself into different states of stress and then train yourself to get back down into a parasympathetic state, your bowling alley lane gets much smaller, meaning it's easier for you to get stressed, it's harder for you to come back to, there's less of let's call it a lane for you to exist. Whereas if you can push yourself and then train yourself to come back down, your lane gets much wider, and there's a lot more room to, I guess, manage your recovery and your outcomes and those kinds of things. So I think in a way this sounds very similar to that, because the end of the lane would be straight stimulus of growth.
We're pushing the barrier of the stimulus to make a bigger lane.
But you don't want to, in terms of the bowling alley, you don't want to be in the bumpers the entire time. That's true. That's not going to be, that eventually that is just going to get smaller. Whereas eventually you're going to need to stay in the middle of the lane at certain points of time. Otherwise, it's just going to get harder for you. I think that applies.
I think it absolutely applies, because that then goes into the third leg between the stimulus, intensity, and recovery. So we send the stimulus, we send the signal. Now is when we're trying to go, like you said, that bumper lane, the highest portion, high signal. And now is where we want to recover and bring everything back to homeostasis.